Welcome back, film fans. Hope you're all well, and this is the first of a series of reviews looking at Bruce Lee's work, courtesy of the recently released Arrow Video box set with the 4K restorations of most of his works. But all of his films, from Big Boss right through to Game of Death, including Enter the Dragon, are present in this box set, and I'll be reviewing them one by one. The first, of course, is, or being, The Big Boss. The Big Boss was first released in 1971. It had its premiere in Hong Kong to kind of immediate commercial and critical acclaim. It became the highest grossing film at that point in Hong Kong history, grossing around, I think, 3.5 million, but don't quote me on that. And it was the kind of first major success for what was at the time the newly formed studio Golden Harvest, which was formed by Raymond Chow. An interesting point to know actually is that each of Lee's subsequent releases in terms of Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon ended up breaking that record, shattering that record that Lee had previously set. So that just shows how big of a deal that Bruce Lee was at the time. It's only with the kind of posthumous release of Enter the Dragon, because obviously Lee died shortly before its premiere, that The Big Boss and the other films will make its way over to the West. The Big Boss, confusingly, when released in the West, is titled, in America anyway, is titled Fists of Fury, even though Lee's second film is called Fist of Fury, so there's that kind of confusing thing to get your head around. So what to say about The Big Boss? I think even amongst diehard Lee fans, it's somewhat maligned or kind of underrated. I think no one ever really says it's their favourite Bruce Lee film, right? But I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to say about it, and a lot of interesting things going on there, precisely because it is Bruce Lee's first film as the martial artist and the movie star that we all know him as. The film wasn't actually shot in Hong Kong at all. It was shot over a period of 4 weeks in Thailand, in this Thai village. The name escapes me now. In this Thai village, I think some shooting towards the end was in Bangkok as well. But the plot essentially revolves around Bruce Lee playing a character, Chen Chi-wan, who comes from China to Thailand to meet up with some fellow family members and co-workers that are already in Thailand to essentially earn money for his family back home, and then take employment in this ice factory where all is not as it seems, as it were, which we'll get into in a second. But the thing to note about Big Boss as well is that at the time, it was customary still for Hong Kong films to be the audio to be in Mandarin. Now, Bruce Lee spoke only American English and Cantonese, so essentially his voice would have been dubbed in post-production. All Chinese films, or Hong Kong films at the time, were recorded with no sound anyway, so all sound is added post-production. But Bruce Lee's voice would have been added in post-production, and it wouldn't have been his own. So that the movie that kind of made him a star, no one actually ever heard. He became a star without actually no one knowing what Bruce Lee sounded like, which is kind of certainly not in the kind of Cantonese dialect, which is an interesting thing to consider. But everyone else in the film kind of speaks Mandarin, which fits in actually to the point of the Mandarin cut of the film, right? So with this set, you have I'll show you, two digipacks. I'll do it this way, it might be easier. So you've got The Big Boss and The Big Boss Mandarin cut. So I'll explain. With get rid of the Arrow promotional thing there. With The Big Boss, you have essentially the cut that we probably all know and grew up with. So in here, it has the kind of the American export cut, and it has the English dubbed version, and it has the Cantonese the Cantonese audio that I certainly is the one that's the one I first saw and listened to. Which has all the kind of the musical cues that I'm familiar with, like with the unlicensed prog tracks, such as like Pink Floyd's Time, which is kind of used as like a ominous motif at certain points throughout the film. And the Big Boss Mandarin cut obviously has the Mandarin audio, different soundtrack. It's a lot sparse. It's a lot more sparse. The soundtrack is not as present, so the film sounds emptier. Of course, the restoration job done by Arrow is wonderful. The pictures never looked better. The sound is crisp as well. So it's in some ways it's like seeing Bruce Lee with fresh eyes. It really is great. And of course the Mandarin cut has 10 minutes of reincorporated footage of what was once lost. Interestingly, apparently Arrow just asked for the footage from Golden Harvest and they just handed it over. So yeah, that's a bit weird. It's almost as if it wasn't lost, but it was long thought of as being lost. So we get 10 minutes of extended scenes. The picture quality of those isn't as good, which is to kind of be expected because it's from the kind of the original, I think, negative. But but that kind of adds, I think, a bit of charm to the film anyway, and actually seeing them in the kind of like original quality with the kind of the hard subs in as well. And those scenes are kind of I can see why they weren't in later cuts, as it were. I think a lot of it's the extending of fight scenes that Bruce isn't in. So, for example, when Bruce first arrives and him and his uncle stop at a flavoured ice vendor, that flavoured ice vendor gets accosted by a couple of thugs, and James Chen's character, who happens to be Brother Zhu, who Bruce Lee ends up staying with, he kind of fends off these 4 or 5 thugs, and that scene's extended, as is when Bruce Lee's, sorry, not Bruce Lee's, but the big boss's thugs are fighting on the lawn of the boss's palace. That's extended as well. There's a slightly more moments, there's a bit more moments of overt violence, including the factory scene where they're cutting up the bodies. But it's a comically bad bit of violence where like the decapitated head is thrown into the ice, and it's clearly a plastic doll head, so that's quite funny. But there are a couple of interesting scenes added in, actually. I think the kind of the long talked about kind of the cart ambush scene is there, which is just kind of interesting to see, just more of Bruce Lee, really. There's some slightly extended bits of dialogue with Bruce, and probably the most notable scene is where he actually visits a brothel, and that's towards his towards the end of the film, on his way to seeing the boss at the end for the final showdown. He actually goes to visit a brothel to sleep with a sex worker. I'm going to assume that was cut because to me it doesn't fit the character that he plays of Chen Chi-wan in that film, and it probably doesn't maybe therefore add to the image of what Lee was trying to portray. But I might be wrong. It could just been for pacing issues. It comes across as a kind of awkward scene. But nonetheless, it is interesting to see. In terms of preference, I would still go with, because of nostalgia purposes and the Mandarin Cut, of course, not having Bruce Lee's war cries and kind of howls and screams, although those were never originally in the Mandarin Cut anyway. They were added after the fact when Bruce Lee had done more films, so they were never originally in the Big Boss. But I'm just used to those. I'm used to the music cues that I can hear, and even just hearing the Cantonese audio. So I'd still go for that, even with the 10 minutes of extra footage in the Mandarin Cut. But nonetheless, I think it's a fascinating curio for people who are Bruce Lee fans. It's a must-see to watch the Mandarin Cut, definitely, just because it's long-lost footage. There's some footage, of course, that still isn't there. The saw in the head scene still isn't present, still hasn't been found, even though there's more evidence than ever that we know it existed at some point, right? There's a featurette actually on the disc that kind of talks about all the clues as to its existence, but not its whereabouts, of course. Presumably still lost in the vaults of Golden Harvest. I think the most interesting actually featurette on this is the location tour now. So 50 years later, we go back and we see the locations in Thailand of where it was filmed, and where Bruce Lee actually stayed in the hotel for 4 weeks during filming. And it's just amazing to see how many of these locations, such as the ice factory, such as Big Boss's palace, the brothel, most of the locations still survive. And the ice factory still is an ice factory, and it looks very, very similar, really. It's been modernised slightly, of course, 50 years have passed, but it's incredible to see these. And of course the lake where Bruce Lee kind of goes down that path of vengeance at the end, towards the end of the film. The lake's still there with the markings on the stone in the background, and it actually becomes kind of like weirdly quite moving, because you get the juxtaposition of the scene with Lee and the modern day scene, of course, without him, and it just, that passage of time, and just the idea of seeing spaces that Lee once occupied it kind of becomes quite poetic as to his absence, right? And really gets to the heart of actually what cinema's kind of about, which is to kind of give presence to absence. And what I mean by that is that Lee's been gone for 50 years now. I've been alive, the entire time I've been alive, Bruce Lee hasn't been. And yet you feel like you know someone through movie, you know, when someone's a movie star, right? You build up a connection to someone that once existed, for example. And that's courtesy of the fact that the invention of moving images. Yes, we have photography before, but moving images is what gives life to someone. You know, literally movement and life to someone. In essence, I suppose immortality, if you like. And so it really kind of gets home that fundamental point about what cinema really, the power of cinema, I think, especially with someone kind of as iconic as Bruce Lee. So it's kind of a sobering reminder, actually, of just how long he's actually been gone. Almost the entire length since the shooting of Fist of Fury in the grand scheme of things, right? Sorry, not Fist of Fury, Big Boss. And Fist of Fury, they were released within a year of each other. So, in terms of, I mean, what's really fascinating to me now as an adult about Big Boss, actually, is the kind of like the politics of the film. Like it's kind of like vaguely anti-capitalist, right? You have this Bruce Lee's character, Chen Chuang, comes to work in this ice factory, which happens to be on the side, is used as a means of smuggling heroin out. So it's essentially a drug factory. Well, it's of smuggling the heroin out. And any employees that find out about it are brutally murdered and dispatched with, to the point where several workers go missing and the workers get increasingly concerned about their whereabouts and restless and kind of threaten a strike, threaten a mutiny, which the responses by the foreman and the manager is to essentially just brutally attack the workers, effectively trying to kill them all with various various workman tools, everything from knives to axes to chains to pipes, garden hose, all sorts of various implements, which, you know, this kind of adds to that kind of like the whole working class milieu of the film, strangely. I mean, Bruce Lee's Big Boss is, I would say, the most overtly violent of all of his films, probably because of all these use of these implements such as knives and whatnot. Bruce Lee doesn't commonly use weapons in his films, so the tone of Big Boss is different to the rest, and I can see why people probably might not like it for that. And what's interesting, actually, is the iconic weapon that Bruce Lee is renowned for using, the nunchaku, was once first and foremost a farming tool. So that kind of is a strange circle how that's the case. But yeah, tonally speaking, in terms of Big Boss, I mean, it's almost like a slasher film at times, the kind of the morbid discovery of the remains in the ice of human bodies and the cutting up of the bodies. There's a bit of slapstick in there that, yeah, kind of still doesn't quite, it never did. I don't think it never did work. You know, where Bruce, like, kind of, for example, hits someone through the wooden wall and they leave a cardboard cutout of their body. But I think to criticize Big Boss on like tonal quality, like it's tonally uneven, or that it's rough around the edges, is a bit unfair, because I think all of Bruce Lee's work suffers from those same flaws. So it'd be a bit harsh to single out the Big Boss for those reasons. But it is definitely more kind of violence than the rest, which might put some people off. Some people might love it more for that reason. And so going back to the fact that these workers are attacked with all these tools, essentially they're trying to murder them all, these workers. It's only when Bruce Lee finally snaps, his pacifism is broken, the pledge that he made to his mother, because the talisman's broken, and there's this iconic moment of Bruce finally snapping and beating up all these bullying underlings to the manager and beating up the foreman and whatnot, is like this kind of brilliant heroic moment for workers, right? And their attempt, therefore, to solve this is to promote him, is to make him the foreman and demote the current one. And then all of a sudden, Bruce, when he's trying to escalate the investigation to the disappearing workers by going to the police on behalf of the workers, he is instead invited to meals by the manager and they get him drunk, which kind of is to create a rift between himself and the rest of the co-workers, who then kind of disown Lee because they think he's kind of they think he's too good for them now. So the workplace politics of the film is quite interesting, and it takes the rest of the workers to be murdered for Bruce to kind of commit down that path of vengeance, that individualistic, heroic path of yeah, essentially wiping out the rest of the big boss's crime syndicate, essentially. I think a lot is to be said about Bruce Lee's performance as well. I don't think that gets... I think it's quite a layered performance. People don't talk about it enough. Yes, of course, he's a phenomenal martial artist. And in fact, the author in the 200-page book of in this Arrow set talks of Lee being a kind of poet of the body, which I think is like really well summed up. I think it's very apt that Lee's expressiveness is his use of language. It doesn't matter that he doesn't speak Mandarin. What matters is his body is a vessel of communication in of itself, right? And Bruce Lee can act with his body in a multitude of ways. If you just look at how he uses his martial arts across his films, they do vary. And we can talk about those nuances when I review the subsequent releases. But also it's a remarkably... I think there's some nuances to Bruce Lee's performance elsewhere as well. His kind of awkwardness and shyness around women kind of goes against the kind of heroic masculine image that he has. The sensitivity that he has. There's that scene where after discovering the rest of his kind of family, well, co-workers that he's living with are murdered, he kind of cradles one of them in this real tender kind of sentimental moment that almost feels very specifically sentimental in a kind of Chinese masculinist sense, as opposed to, you wouldn't see that in an American film. Obviously, American masculinity kind of, if you look at 80s action films, always comes out with these homoerotic, it's repressed, so it comes out in these kind of like homoerotic undertones. Whereas the Chinese masculinity is very different. I mean, you look at the films of John Woo, there is this kind of romantic, you know, the kind of brotherhood and sentimentality to the films. And you kind of see a glimpse of that in Bruce Lee, I think, in this film. So there is dynamics to the performance, and I think the reason why this role is so iconic and important, and why Big Boss is a seminal film, not just in the context of Lee's work, but in martial arts cinema in general, is because this was the first film, and because the plot line has him being a pacifist who can't commit violence until the point where his workers are being beaten up, and then he's hit again, and his talisman's broken, which is the symbol of this pacifist stance that he holds, this obligation to his family. Then comes out the rage, and it's this great symbolic, iconic moment of what kind of Lee stands for, which is across all of his films, there's this thematic thread of violence as a last resort, and that gets incorporated, I think, more and more into his films the more control he has over expressing his martial arts philosophy in his films over time. But there is that pacifist strain where violence is a last resort, martial arts as being a kind of a way of expressing oneself, as a way of being, a way of life, is present right from the beginning in a way. And it is great to see. I think as well, what has to be said in terms of the iconicity of Bruce Lee in The Big Boss also is with the sense of when he finally snaps, right? It's bottled up rage. And I think there was a lot of frustration in Bruce Lee at the time in not being able to crack the American market, right? Of being given these kind of, let's be honest, the latent racism that was in America at the time towards casting Asian people in leading roles, giving them these effete servile stereotypes, which Bruce Lee turns out is anything but, is why he went to Hong Kong in the first place. To crack this market and become a star there is because they gave him the roles that, as we can now see, he clearly deserved and needed. And so that rage and frustration is, I think, really evident in The Big Boss, or at least it matches up to what we see in the narrative of it exploding on screen, and it makes it all the more iconic. Interestingly, actually, so he was already known in the East for his work on the Green Hornet, because they didn't see it as the Green Hornet show, they actually called it the Kato show. So he was already a star just for being a presence on screen in the East. So that just shows you the difference there in terms of representation. And of course, Lee now is synonymous with kind of Asian masculinity and oppressed, a voice of being the oppressed. The reason why he was so popular with African American audiences in the 70s is because he fit in with the kind of blaxploitation film market of having as a figure of alternative representation, yeah, of subaltern representation, of being something different, standing up for the oppressed and the marginalized. It made Bruce Lee just hugely popular with different parts of the community in America as well as abroad. So to sum up my thoughts on the Big Boss, yeah, I again, a picture with a lot of charm. I think it's aged fine, although that could be my nostalgia, and certainly. So I watched the Mandarin cut, and then I watched the cut with the Cantonese audio just to again have that nostalgic feel of what I once saw. Again, it's seeing it with fresh eyes. It feels like, and Bruce Lee's kind of more radiant on screen than ever, which is of course wonderful, right? That's what we all want to see. So yeah, let me know your thoughts. What you think of, if you've seen the Mandarin Cut, what do you think of Mandarin Cut? What do you think of the Big Boss in general? Where do you place it in the context of Lee's work? Just let me know your thoughts in general, and hopefully you'll join me for what will be the next review, which of course is Bruce Lee's second film, Fist of Fury. Almost said Way of the Dragon then. Fist of Fury. So hopefully I'll catch you all then. Take care.